Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling the complex and, honestly, sometimes shocking truth behind how we actually measure global wealth. What does a good life even mean based on the data? I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this, because as you probably already know, those big numbers we see on the news, they rarely tell the whole story.
Okay, let's just quickly look at our roadmap for today. We're going to cover measuring a good life, the limits of GDP, a better way using the HDI, why standards differ, and finally, the divide, within versus between. This is going to take us step by step from how we define wealth to why there's such a massive divide globally.
Before we even look at the hard data, we really have to ask ourselves a core question. What does it actually mean to have a high standard of living? I mean, it seems simple enough, right? A nice house, good food, maybe a stable income. But as we'll soon see, wealth doesn't always equal well-being. It turns out measuring living standards accurately is incredibly tricky, and economists have to use a whole toolkit to get the full picture. So let's jump right into Section 1, Measuring a Good Life. We'll start with the most common measuring stick economists use to gauge a country's success.
So you've definitely heard of gross domestic product, or GDP. It measures the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. But here's the thing. Just looking at a country's total wealth doesn't actually tell us much about the people who live there. By dividing that massive GDP number by the total population, we get this absolutely crucial average income figure per person, real GDP per head. It's basically the gold standard for quick comparisons.
And to see the absolute top end of that scale, just look at Luxembourg. They boast a staggering average real GDP per head of $135,000. But to put that into perspective and show just how incredibly wide the global gap is, while Luxembourg is sitting at this massive number, a low-income country like Burundi is sitting at the lowest end globally with just $240 per person. It is a literal night and day contrast.
Now, the really crucial point here is that we must always use real GDP for these comparisons, not nominal GDP. Why? Well, nominal GDP measures economic output at current prices. So if prices rise because of inflation, nominal GDP goes up, which makes a country look wealthier, even if they literally didn't produce a single extra thing. It's kind of like getting a raise that exactly matches the rising cost of your morning coffee. Real GDP strips away that inflation illusion by using a base year, and that gives us a much more honest comparison across time.
And that leads us right into Section 2, the limits of GDP. Real GDP per head is widely used and is delightfully simple to calculate, but it has some massive blind spots when it comes to measuring actual human lives.
Just consider the Qatar paradox. On paper, Qatar looks like an absolute utopia with an incredibly high GDP per head of around $88,000, mostly fueled by oil and gas. But that average masks a pretty harsh reality of deep inequality. Over 85% of Qatar's workforce is actually made up of migrant workers who often live in poor conditions and earn very low wages. GDP per head gives absolutely zero indication of this deep inequality. The rich elite is simply inflating the average for everyone else.
And you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to its flaws. Relying solely on a monetary average means we completely ignore vital non-monetary aspects of well-being. GDP really doesn't care if a population is highly educated or severely ill. It doesn't measure political freedom, it ignores environmental damage, and it totally misses the reality of purchasing power. I mean, $10,000 buys much more in India than it does in Norway, right? A single number just isn't enough to capture the whole shebang.
Economists definitely recognize these flaws, and they needed a solution. Let's move to Section 3, a better way with the HDI. Enter the Human Development Index, or HDI. Created by the United Nations Development Program back in 1990, the HDI looks far beyond just income. It actually seeks to measure genuine human development by scoring nations on a scale from 0 to 1. So a score of exactly 1 would represent the highest possible level of human development.
The HDI is built on 3 equal pillars. First up is access to knowledge, which is measured by both the mean and expected years of schooling. Second is how long a person is expected to live at birth, which beautifully reflects healthcare and nutrition. And third is a decent standard of living, measured by gross national income per capita. And this is brilliantly adjusted for purchasing power, so we can fairly compare across borders.
Now, when we look at the actual global rankings, the contrast becomes incredibly clear. Switzerland and Norway consistently sit right at the very top. Norway, for example, really shines with a life expectancy of around 83 years and 18 expected years of schooling. This completely proves why HDI is a much more complete picture. Norway's high score reflects its universal healthcare, free university, and shared national wealth, while countries lower down the index face real systemic challenges in those exact same areas.
Let's put them side by side for a second. While GDP is fantastic for tracking pure economic output and overall growth, HDI is vastly superior for measuring the actual quality of life within a nation. GDP is just a single economic indicator that completely ignores how wealth is distributed. HDI, on the other hand, being a composite of those three dimensions, recognizes that a high income doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't have the health or education to actually enjoy it.
Knowing how we measure these standards naturally leads us right into Section 4. Why do standards differ? Like, why is one country thriving while another struggles? Well, the differences arise from a pretty complex mix of historical, social, and geographic factors, but we can distill them down into these 7 core points. These factors are literally the engines that drive or stall a nation's prosperity and the well-being of its citizens. Access to quality education builds human capital, while global trade integration can lift millions out of poverty. But 2 of these factors deserve a much closer look. Let's start with government policy and institutions, because these are incredibly impactful. Denmark is a prime example of good governance. They boast very low corruption, which allows their tax revenues to fund world-class public services, creating a super high standard of living. On the flip side, just look at Venezuela. Despite having massive natural oil reserves, corruption and mismanagement caused an absolute collapse in living standards. I mean, their GDP per head dramatically plummeted from around $13,000 to under $3,000 in less than a decade. It just goes to show, good institutions matter every bit as much as natural wealth. Geography presents some really unique challenges too. Both the Netherlands and Bangladesh are low-lying, flood-prone delta countries. But geography is in destiny, right? The Netherlands utilized robust institutions and massive infrastructure investments in advanced engineering to become a high-income nation. Bangladesh, dealing with limited infrastructure and resources, currently remains a lower middle-income country. It's a stark reminder that while geography might create the hurdle, human investment determines if a country can actually clear it. Finally, let's explore Section 5, the divide, within versus between. We really need to understand that inequality isn't just a story of rich nations versus poor nations. The gaps between nations are often driven by big macro factors: integration into global trade, natural resource endowments, and differing levels of industrialization. But when we zoom in, the stark gaps within nations are driven by a completely different set of structural inequalities. We are talking about massive disparities between urban and rural areas, persistent gender pay gaps, racial income inequality, and the incredibly powerful advantages of inherited wealth.
To properly measure this internal distribution of wealth, economists rely on something called the Gini coefficient. It's basically a statistical scale where 0 represents perfect equality, meaning literally everyone has the exact same income. And 1 means maximum inequality, where a single person holds absolutely all of the country's wealth. So the closer a country is to 1, the more unequal it is.
South Africa serves as a really stark, sobering example of this. It has one of the highest Gini scores in the world at approximately 0.63, which is deeply rooted in the historical legacy of apartheid. Because of this structural inequality, South Africa is actually classified as an upper-middle income country based on its overall GDP, yet over 55% of its population still lives in poverty. It proves, without a doubt, that an economy can grow without actually lifting its people up. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. As you've seen throughout this explainer, GDP can soar, natural resources can be abundant, but if the average person lacks education, healthcare, and equal opportunity, those numbers are just a mirage. As we evaluate what true economic development actually looks like moving forward, we have to ask ourselves, who is the growth really for? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you in the next explainer.